The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky terrain of eastern Afghanistan as Staff Sergeant Mike "Hawk" Harrison adjusted his position behind a crumbling stone wall. The 31-year-old Navy SEAL team leader wiped sweat from his brow and checked his watch. They had been pinned down for over 6 hours now, and ammunition was running dangerously low. What had started as a routine reconnaissance mission in the Kunar province had quickly turned into a nightmare. The intelligence reports had been wrong, dead wrong. Instead of finding a small Taliban outpost with maybe a dozen fighters, Harrison and his team of elite SEALs had stumbled into what appeared to be a major enemy stronghold housing nearly 400 insurgents. The morning had begun like any other in this god-forsaken corner of Afghanistan. Harrison's team, call sign Neptune 6, had been tasked with gathering intelligence on suspected Taliban weapon caches in a remote valley. The mission briefing back at Bagram Air Base had seemed straightforward enough. Satellite imagery showed a few scattered buildings and what looked like supply routes used by insurgents moving weapons from Pakistan. But as Neptune 6 crested the ridge overlooking the valley at dawn, Harrison knew immediately that something was very wrong. Through his binoculars, he could see dozens of armed fighters moving between buildings that intelligence had marked as abandoned. Vehicles were parked everywhere, and the distinctive black flags of a major Taliban cell flew from several rooftops. "This isn't right," whispered Petty Officer Jake Morrison, the team's communications specialist, as he crawled up beside Harrison. "Intel said this place was supposed to be a ghost town." Harrison nodded grimly. In his 12 years as a SEAL, including 4 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, he had learned to trust his instincts. And right now, every instinct was screaming that they needed to get out of there immediately. But before they could begin their retreat, the distinctive crack of an AK-47 echoed across the valley. Then another. Within seconds, the entire mountainside erupted in gunfire as Taliban fighters poured out of buildings and began advancing up the slope toward their position. "Contact! Contact!" Morrison shouted into his radio as bullets began striking the rocks around them. "Neptune 6 is under heavy fire. We need immediate support." What followed was a desperate fighting withdrawal as Harrison led his team higher up the mountainside, seeking better defensive positions. The Taliban fighters, emboldened by their overwhelming numbers, pressed their attack relentlessly. They knew they had cornered some of America's most elite warriors, and they weren't about to let them escape. For the first few hours, the SEALs' superior training and equipment allowed them to hold their own. They moved tactically from position to position, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. Each SEAL was worth 10 Taliban fighters in terms of marksmanship and tactical awareness. But numbers were numbers, and the enemy had them in overwhelming force. As the day wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. The Taliban had surrounded their position on 3 sides with only a sheer cliff face preventing a complete encirclement. Ammunition was being consumed at an alarming rate, and several team members had sustained wounds from the constant barrage of enemy fire. Petty Officer Lisa Chen, the team's medic, worked frantically to treat wounded SEALs while bullets whistled overhead. "We've got to get out of here, Hawk," she called out to Harrison between bursts of gunfire. "Davis has taken shrapnel to the leg, and Rodriguez is bleeding pretty bad from that head wound." Harrison surveyed their dire situation. They were trapped on a narrow ledge about halfway up the mountain, with Taliban fighters advancing from below and no clear escape route. The enemy had brought up mortars and rocket-propelled grenades, making their position even more precarious. Every few minutes, explosions would rock their defensive line, sending chunks of rock flying in all directions. The team's radio operator, Morrison, had been trying desperately to reach higher command for hours. "Bagram Base, this is Neptune 6. We are in contact with an estimated 400 enemy fighters. Request immediate close air support and extraction. Over." Static was the only response. They were too far out, in too remote a location, for their standard communications equipment to reach friendly forces. The mountains that provided them with some defensive cover were also blocking their radio signals from getting through to potential rescue forces. As afternoon turned to evening, Harrison made a difficult decision. They would have to break radio silence and use their emergency beacon, even though doing so would reveal their exact position to any enemy forces monitoring radio frequencies. It was a calculated risk, but with wounded team members and dwindling ammunition, they were running out of options. "Morrison, activate the emergency beacon," Harrison ordered. "Send our coordinates to anyone who's listening. We need help, and we need it now." The powerful emergency transmitter sent out a distress signal that could be picked up by military forces across the region. Within minutes, responses started coming in from various coalition bases, but the responses weren't encouraging. The nearest friendly ground forces were over 50 miles away, and it would take hours for them to reach Neptune 6's position. By then, it would almost certainly be too late. As darkness began to fall over the Afghan mountains, the Taliban fighters lit fires throughout the valley below, creating an eerie, hellish glow that illuminated their positions. The enemy was settling in for what they clearly expected to be a final assault once they had the cover of darkness. They had the Americans trapped, and they knew it. Harrison gathered his team for what might be their final briefing. 7 battle-hardened Navy SEALs, each one a veteran of multiple combat deployments, looked at their leader with grim determination. They all understood the situation. They were vastly outnumbered, running low on ammunition, and trapped in an impossible position. But they were SEALs, and SEALs never gave up. "Listen up," Harrison said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of enemy fighters shouting to each other in Pashto. "We're in a tight spot, no doubt about it. But we've been in tight spots before, and we've always found a way out. We're going to hold this position as long as we can and make every round count." The team members nodded, checking their weapons and redistributing the remaining ammunition. They had maybe 200 rounds left between all of them. Against 400 enemy fighters, it wouldn't last long in a sustained firefight. Morrison continued monitoring the radio, hoping against hope that some miracle would appear on the airwaves. Coalition aircraft had been notified of their situation, but most were committed to other operations or too far away to provide timely support. The few that might be able to help were having difficulty locating their exact position in the darkness and mountainous terrain. As the night deepened, the sound of enemy movement grew closer. Taliban fighters were working their way up the mountainside under cover of darkness, preparing for what they undoubtedly hoped would be a final assault. The SEALs could hear voices, the clink of equipment and the scrape of boots on stone as hundreds of insurgents positioned themselves for the attack. Harrison peered through his night vision goggles at the advancing enemy forces. In the green-tinted world of infrared imaging, he could see Taliban fighters moving like ants across the mountainside. They were being methodical about it, taking their time to position themselves properly for an overwhelming assault. They wanted to be absolutely certain of victory when they finally attacked. The SEAL team leader made final preparations for what was likely to be their last stand. He positioned his men to cover all possible approaches to their position and made sure each one understood their fields of fire. If they were going down, they would take as many enemy fighters with them as possible. But even as Harrison prepared for the worst, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. In his years of combat experience, he had learned to recognize the subtle shifts in atmosphere that often preceded unexpected developments. The night air seemed to carry a different quality, a sense of anticipation that went beyond the impending Taliban assault. Unknown to the trapped SEALs, their emergency beacon had been picked up by someone who was in a position to help. Someone who was about to risk everything to save them. 200 miles away at Kandahar Airfield, Captain Sarah "Storm" Mitchell was just finishing her post-flight inspection when her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, came running across the tarmac with an urgent message. "Captain Mitchell, You need to hear this right now, Rodriguez shouted over the noise of aircraft engines and ground vehicles moving around the busy airbase. Mitchell looked up from her A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog for its ungainly appearance but devastating effectiveness in close air support missions. The 29-year-old pilot had just returned from her second combat mission of the day, providing close air support for Army units operating near Helmand Province. She was tired, hungry, and looking forward to a hot meal and some sleep. But Rodriguez's expression told her that sleep would have to wait. "What's the situation?" Mitchell asked, wiping grease from her hands with a maintenance rag. "Emergency beacon from some Navy SEALs trapped up in Kunar Province," Rodriguez explained rapidly. "They're surrounded by hundreds of Taliban fighters and requesting immediate close air support. Nobody else is available, and they're running out of time." Mitchell frowned. Kunar Province was in the complete opposite direction from her usual area of operations, and it was well outside the normal range of her A-10. The twin-engine attack aircraft was built for loitering over battlefields and providing sustained fire support, but it wasn't designed for long-range missions across Afghanistan's vast distances. "What about the F-16s at Bagram?" she asked. "Or the Apache gunships? Surely someone closer can respond." Rodriguez shook his head. "The F-16s are all committed to a major operation in Helmand, and the Apaches don't have the range to reach that far into the mountains and still have enough fuel to be effective. Flight operations says you're the only pilot available with an aircraft that might be able to reach them." Mitchell walked around her A-10, mentally calculating distances and fuel consumption. The mathematics were not encouraging. Kunar Province was at the absolute limit of her aircraft's range, even with external fuel tanks. If she went, she would have maybe 20 minutes over the target area before she'd need to head back to avoid running out of fuel completely. And that was assuming everything went perfectly with no complications or delays. But as she thought about those Navy SEALs trapped in the mountains, facing overwhelming odds with no other hope of rescue, the decision became clear. She had joined the Air Force to protect American lives and support ground troops in combat. If there was even a small chance she could make a difference, she had to try. "Get my bird refueled and loaded with a full combat load," Mitchell ordered Rodriguez. "And I want external fuel tanks on both wing pylons. We're going to need every drop of fuel we can carry." Rodriguez nodded and began shouting orders to the ground crew. Within minutes, the aircraft was surrounded by maintenance personnel working frantically to prepare the A-10 for its emergency mission. Fuel trucks rumbled up to top off the aircraft's tanks, while ordnance crews loaded the 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger cannon with 1,150 rounds of 30mm ammunition. Mitchell headed to the Squadron Operations Center to get a detailed briefing on the situation. The intelligence officer on duty, Major Thompson, spread out maps of eastern Afghanistan and marked the last known position of the trapped SEAL team. "They're here, on this ridgeline, about 12 miles northeast of Asadabad," Thompson explained, pointing to a location that looked impossibly remote and hostile. "Latest communication indicates they're surrounded by an estimated 400 Taliban fighters and running critically low on ammunition. They've been under continuous fire for over 8 hours." Mitchell studied the terrain carefully. The mountains in that region rose to over 10,000 feet, with narrow valleys and steep ridgelines that would make flying extremely challenging, especially at night. Weather reports indicated scattered clouds and moderate winds, but conditions could change rapidly in the mountains. "What about threat levels?" Mitchell asked. "Are we looking at just small arms fire, or do they have heavy weapons and surface-to-air missiles?" "Intelligence suggests mostly small arms and RPGs, but we can't rule out man-portable air defense systems," Thompson replied. "The Taliban have been known to move man-pads through this area, so you'll need to be extremely careful about your approach and attack profiles." Mitchell nodded grimly. Man-portable air defense systems, or man-pads, were shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles that could bring down even heavily armored aircraft like the A-10. Flying low enough to provide effective close air support would put her directly in their engagement envelope. As Mitchell prepared for takeoff, she received a final radio communication from the trapped SEALs. The voice was calm and professional, but she could hear the strain underneath. Any station. This is Neptune 6. We are in desperate need of close air support. Enemy forces are massing for what appears to be a final assault. We have wounded and are critically low on ammunition. Time is running out. Mitchell keyed her radio. Neptune 6, this is Hog 27. I'm en route to your position with close air support. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Hold tight. There was a pause before the response came back. Hog 27, Neptune 6. Roger that. We'll be here waiting for you. Mitchell could hear the relief in the SEAL team leader's voice, even though both of them knew that her arrival wouldn't guarantee their survival. She was one aircraft against hundreds of enemy fighters in extremely challenging terrain. But sometimes, one aircraft was enough to change the course of a battle. As her A-10 lifted off from Kandahar airfield, Mitchell began what would be one of the most dangerous and difficult missions of her career. She flew northeast across Afghanistan's rugged landscape, following valleys when possible to stay below radar coverage while conserving fuel for the long journey ahead. The flight gave her time to think about what she was flying into. Mitchell had flown dozens of close air support missions during her deployment, but this one was different. Usually, she worked with ground controllers who could guide her to targets and provide real-time intelligence about enemy positions and friendly forces. This time, she would be flying into an active firefight with minimal information and no margin for error. As she crossed into the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, Mitchell could see the glow of fires in the distance. The Taliban fighters weren't trying to hide their presence. They were confident in their overwhelming numerical advantage. In their minds, the Americans were already dead. It was just a matter of time. Mitchell checked her fuel gauges and weapon systems one final time. She had enough fuel for maybe 30 minutes over the target area, and then she would need to head straight back to base with no reserves. Her A-10 carried a full load of 30mm cannon ammunition and 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles for precision strikes against hardened targets. But as she approached the reported position of the trapped SEALs, Mitchell realized that her biggest challenge wouldn't be fuel or enemy fire. It would be identifying friend from foe in the darkness and chaos of a close-quarters firefight. One mistake, one misidentified target, and she could end up killing the very people she had come to save. The radio crackled to life as she approached the target area. Hog 27, this is Neptune 6. We can hear your engines. The enemy is all around us in a rough circle. We're marking our position with an infrared strobe that should be visible through your targeting systems. Mitchell activated her night vision equipment and began searching for the infrared marker. In the green-tinted world of thermal imaging, she could see heat signatures scattered across the mountainside. Some were stationary, others moving. But identifying which ones were friendly forces and which were Taliban fighters would require extreme precision and careful coordination with the ground team. Neptune 6, I have multiple heat signatures in your area, Mitchell reported. I need you to guide me onto specific targets to avoid any chance of friendly fire. Roger. Hog 27. The enemy is positioned in a rough semicircle about 200 meters downslope from our position. They've got mortars set up in a cluster of buildings at the base of the ridge and machine gun positions along the tree line to our east and west. Mitchell began her attack run, knowing that once she opened fire, there would be no turning back. The Taliban fighters would know exactly where she was and would do everything possible to bring her down. But somewhere below in the darkness, 7 American warriors were counting on her to even the odds and give them a chance to survive the night. Mitchell rolled her A-10 into a steep dive, targeting the cluster of buildings where the SEAL team had identified enemy mortar positions. The Warthog's targeting systems painted the structures in bright thermal imagery, showing dozens of heat signatures moving around what appeared to be weapon emplacements. "Neptune 6, I'm beginning my attack run on the mortar positions," Mitchell announced over the radio. "Keep your heads down." The A-10's GAU-8 cannon erupted in a thunderous roar that echoed across the mountains. The 7-barrel Gatling gun fired at an incredible rate, sending streams of 30mm depleted uranium rounds into the Taliban positions below. Each round was the size of a small bottle and capable of penetrating armored vehicles. Against human targets and light structures, the effect was devastating. Mitchell watched through her targeting display as her cannon fire walked across the enemy positions. Buildings erupted in clouds of dust and debris as the high-explosive rounds found their targets. Secondary explosions indicated that she had hit stored ammunition and mortar rounds, amplifying the destruction. But the Taliban fighters didn't retreat. Instead, they began firing everything they had at Mitchell's aircraft. Streams of tracer rounds arced up through the darkness like deadly fireworks, and she could see the bright flashes of rocket-propelled grenades being launched in her direction. "Taking fire from multiple positions," Mitchell reported calmly. Even as her aircraft shuddered from impacts, the A-10 was designed to absorb tremendous punishment, but that didn't make flying through a storm of gunfire any less terrifying. She pulled out of her attack run and climbed rapidly, seeking altitude and distance from the enemy weapons. As she maneuvered for another attack, Harrison's voice came over the radio with crucial information. "Hog 27, your last pass was right on target. The mortar fire has stopped completely, but we've got heavy concentrations of fighters moving up the eastern slope, about 300 meters from our position. They look like they're preparing for an assault." Mitchell banked her aircraft around and began searching for the advancing Taliban forces. Through her night vision systems, she could see dozens of heat signatures moving uphill in what appeared to be coordinated assault formations. The enemy was taking advantage of the temporary reprieve to launch their final attack on the trapped SEALs. "I have eyes on the eastern slope," Mitchell confirmed. "Multiple enemy fighters advancing in your direction. I'm going to hit them with cannon fire, but I need you to mark your exact position so I don't get too close." "Roger that. We're marking our position with infrared strobes now." Mitchell could see the blinking lights through her targeting system, providing a clear reference point for friendly forces. The advancing Taliban fighters were spread out across a wide area, making them more difficult to target effectively, but also preventing them from concentrating their firepower. She lined up for another attack run, this time approaching from the west to give herself the best angle on the enemy forces. As she dove toward the mountainside, Mitchell could see muzzle flashes from the SEALs' position as they engaged the closest Taliban fighters with their remaining ammunition. The A-10's cannon roared again, stitching a line of destruction across the enemy advance. Taliban fighters scattered in all directions as 30mm rounds exploded among their ranks. Some took cover behind rocks and trees, while others continued their advance despite the devastating fire from above. Mitchell's fuel gauges were showing dangerously low levels, but she couldn't leave yet. The SEAL team was still heavily outnumbered, and the Taliban forces were regrouping for another assault. She had maybe 10 minutes of fuel remaining before she would be forced to return to base or risk crashing in the mountains. "Neptune 6, what's your ammunition status?" she asked over the radio. Harrison's response was grim. "We're down to our last magazines. Maybe 50 rounds total between all of us. If they mount another coordinated assault, we won't be able to hold them off." Mitchell made a difficult decision. She still had 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, precision-guided weapons designed for destroying hardened targets. They were too valuable to waste on scattered infantry, but if she could find the right target, they might be able to break the Taliban's will to continue the attack. Scanning the valley below, Mitchell spotted what appeared to be a command post in one of the larger buildings. Vehicles were parked nearby, and thermal imagery showed significant activity in the area. If Taliban commanders were coordinating the assault from that location, destroying it might cause enough confusion to give the SEALs a chance to escape. "I'm going to hit what looks like a command post with a precision strike," Mitchell announced. "That should buy you some time to move to a better position if possible." She locked onto the building with her targeting system and launched one of her Maverick missiles. The weapon streaked through the darkness, guided by its own infrared seeker, and slammed into the structure with tremendous force. The explosion lit up the entire valley, and secondary blasts indicated that the building had contained significant ammunition stores. The effect on the Taliban forces was immediate and dramatic. The coordinated assault began to falter as fighters looked around in confusion, unsure of what was happening to their command structure. Some began retreating down the mountain, while others held their positions but seemed reluctant to advance further. Mitchell seized the opportunity to make one final attack run with her remaining ammunition. She targeted the largest concentrations of enemy fighters, walking her cannon fire across their positions and forcing them to seek cover or retreat. The psychological effect of the A-10's devastating firepower was often as important as its physical impact. But even as Mitchell scored hit after hit on the Taliban positions, her fuel situation was becoming critical. Warning lights were flashing on her instrument panel, and she could feel the engines beginning to lose power as the fuel tanks approached empty. "Neptune 6, I'm Winchester on fuel," Mitchell announced, using the military term for being out of ammunition or, in this case, dangerously low on fuel. "I have to return to base immediately. Can you move to a better position while the enemy is disorganized?" Harrison's response came back immediately. "Affirmative, Hog 2-7. The enemy assault has broken off and we can see fighters retreating down the mountain. We're going to move to a more defensible position and try to reach an extraction point." "Roger that. Help is on the way. Other aircraft are being scrambled to your location and ground forces are en route. Hold tight." As Mitchell turned her aircraft toward Kandahar airfield, she could see the effects of her attack spread across the mountainside below. Fires burned in multiple locations where her weapons had found their targets, and the organized enemy assault had dissolved into chaos and confusion. The flight back to base was tense, with Mitchell carefully monitoring her fuel consumption and engine performance. She had pushed her aircraft to its absolute limits, flying farther than recommended and engaging in extended combat operations that had consumed fuel at an alarming rate. As the lights of Kandahar airfield appeared on the horizon, Mitchell allowed herself a moment of relief. She had made it back safely, and more importantly, she had given the trapped SEAL team a fighting chance to survive until additional help arrived. The landing was smooth, despite Mitchell's exhaustion and the aircraft's near-empty fuel tanks. As she taxied to the flight line, ground crews were already waiting with fuel trucks and maintenance equipment. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez was among them, his face showing a mixture of relief and admiration. "How did it go, Captain?" Rodriguez asked as Mitchell climbed down from the cockpit. "7 American warriors are still alive because of what we did tonight," Mitchell replied simply. "That's what matters." Over the next several hours, additional air support arrived in the area where Neptune 6 was trapped. F-16 fighters from Bagram Air Base conducted follow-up strikes on remaining Taliban positions, while a special operations helicopter team was able to extract the wounded SEALs to safety. All 7 members of Neptune 6 survived the ordeal, though several required medical treatment for their wounds. Staff Sergeant Harrison later credited Mitchell's timely intervention with saving their lives, noting that the Taliban assault would have overrun their position within minutes if she hadn't arrived when she did. Mitchell's actions that night earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the military's highest decorations for heroism in aerial combat. But for her, the real reward was the knowledge that her willingness to risk everything had brought 7 fellow warriors home safely. The rescue of Neptune 6 became legendary within special operations and close air support communities. It demonstrated the incredible courage and skill of both the ground forces who held out against impossible odds and the pilot who risked her life to save them. In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where the margin between life and death could be measured in minutes and ammunition rounds, their story became a testament to the warrior ethos that binds all military personnel together. Years later, when Mitchell was asked about that night, she would say that she had simply done what any pilot would do for fellow service members in trouble. But those who knew the details of the mission understood that her actions went far beyond duty. She had risked her aircraft, her career, and her life to save 7 people she had never met, flying into a situation where the odds of success were minimal and the chances of survival even smaller. The mountains of Afghanistan had witnessed countless acts of heroism during America's longest war. But few could match the drama and courage displayed during the rescue of Neptune 6. In a conflict often measured in strategic objectives and political considerations, their story served as a reminder of the individual acts of bravery and sacrifice that defined the human cost of military service.